Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 38 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the New York Rangers, in which the Sharks have lost 3-0. So this marks the end of their 3-game winning streak, even though this is the fourth straight game in which the Sharks gave up just 2 goals on a manned net. However, unlike the previous 3 games where the Sharks managed to score 3 goals to get the victory, they couldn't get even a single one past Igor Shesterkin, and as such would end up losing this one 3-0. This is actually the second time this season in just 2 games in which the Sharks were shut out by Shesterkin and the New York Rangers. The Sharks just can't seem to solve that goaltender. And you know how in meteorology, there's sometimes 2 storms or systems that end up combining to create one particular superstorm that ends up doing a lot of damage. Well, to put that into hockey terms here tonight, it was the storm of the San Jose Sharks' offensive issues that have been surrounding the team all of this season thus far, combining with the storm of Igor Shesterkin on the New York Rangers, who has been one of, if not the best goaltender in the NHL thus far this season, to create a superstorm that resulted in the Sharks not managing to get even a single goal here tonight and losing it 3-0. And the major issue was not that the Sharks didn't get a lot of chances. It's not as though the Sharks didn't play well enough to win. In fact, you could say that the Sharks were the better team here tonight over the New York Rangers and deserved to get the victory. The major problem is that there were no real sure goals, which when you're up against a goaltender as fantastic as Igor Shesterkin is and has been, you need to be able to get a sure goal to be able to actually get one on the board on that particular night. A sure goal in my eyes is like the one scored by Timo Meier in the previous game against the Detroit Red Wings. A pass, very nice one from Jonathan Dahlen. It goes across the crease. No chance for Nedeljkovic to make the save there on Timo Meier. There would have been no chance for Shesterkin. There would have been no chance for a prime Carey Price. There would have been no chance for Vasilevsky. No chance for Martin Brodeur, Patrick Roy, whoever you want to point to, because it is what you would call a sure goal. But none of that really happened here tonight, obviously, for the San Jose Sharks. While they had some great chances, breakaways and 2-on-1s, there just weren't a lot of second, third, fourth opportunities on net, and Shesterkin was just solidly able to get pucks, not give up any rebounds, and so the Sharks end up being kept off the board. Moving on into the periods here. First period, the Sharks actually played rather well, didn't really allow the Rangers to get too many chances, and at even strength, the Sharks were certainly the better team, had some great opportunities. The Rangers were blocking a lot of shots here tonight, but the only goal scored in the first period was actually from the Rangers side and shorthanded, and this has been a big issue for the Sharks thus far this season. Their defensive play win on the power play. When at even strength, the San Jose Sharks usually do a very good job at shutting things down defensively. They handle rushes rather well. They keep pucks to the perimeter when the other team is in the offensive zone, and just generally are a rather solid team on the defensive side of things. But if a switch seems to flip when they are actually up 5-on-4 on the power play, in that they just kind of hope the puck is going to end up back on their stick and they can transition quickly back to the offensive side of things. This goal ends up resulting on a 2-on-2. Very simple. Obviously, one of the 2 players back for the Sharks is a forward. That one is Dahlen, but still relatively simple to just try and defend because you've got the easy back check coming back because you have the extra player on the ice. This should never really result in even that great of a chance on net, but for whatever reason, Dahlen decides to overload onto one particular side of the ice. And yes, if you block this pass from Zibanejad, you probably can quickly transition the other way on the 3-on-2, maybe even a 4-on-2. But if the pass goes through, like it ended up doing so, you give a very clear opportunity for a player like Chris Kreider, who is a very good goal scorer, and he ends up getting one past Adin Hill. The 6th shorthanded goal that the Sharks have given up this season, that puts them tied for first in the league in that particular stat with the Philadelphia Flyers and the New Jersey Devils. And no sort of offense to those 2 teams, but you don't really want to be tied in a particular stat, especially a negative stat like shorthanded goals given up, with teams like the Flyers and the New Jersey Devils. It's not a particularly good look. And so that's just one area of the Sharks game that has been an issue thus far this season. But really not the end of the world. The Sharks trailing 1-0 after a rather strong first period, at the very least even strength. What ends up happening in the second period? Well, the second period, things kind of continue the same way. Maybe not as dominant at even strength. Maybe I shouldn't use the word dominant either, but not as strong at even strength like in the first period. But still, the Sharks were the team getting the majority of the chances. Again, a lot of block shots from the Rangers, a lot of great saves from Igor Shesterkin. Yes, you're getting breakaways from Cogliano and 2-on-1 opportunities for chances from Meier and Jonathan Dahlin. But there's just, like I said, not a lot of second and third opportunities. And so at the end of 40 minutes, the Sharks are still trailing 1-0. Early in the third period, we have Schneider, who gets his first career goal in his first career game, something that used to happen a lot with the San Jose Sharks, but this period has been a bit of an exception in that regard. The Sharks have not given up a lot of first career goals to players thus far this season, so this one being in the first career goal of his first career game, maybe that's the start of something there. Hopefully not, but you'll never know. And so the Rangers take a 2-0 lead early in the third period. And the third period, which was the period that you would hope would be the best for the Sharks to try and get back in, actually ended up being rather even and potentially even Rangers favored. The Sharks got some chances, but they also loosened up a bit on their defensive side, which gave the Rangers some chances. Adin Hill had to make a couple of saves, and he did do that. But in the end, the Sharks can't get another one in. And while they do get a late period power play, nothing gets by Shesterkin. An empty netter is added by Kreider, and it's a 3-0 win for the Rangers. On to the forwards here tonight. We have the first line of Meier, Hertl, and Rudolfs Balcers. Balcers returns to the lineup. He ends up replacing Barabanov, who exits the lineup due to the COVID protocol. And Balcers, I don't think actually was much worse than Barabanov. I don't think he was necessarily much better than Barabanov either. He was a solid complement to the dynamic duo of Hertl and Meier. Hertl slightly quieter than his usual in the past couple of games, but Timo Meier still pretty dynamic here tonight, I must say. Still orchestrating a lot of strong offensive chances for himself and for his line mates. Obviously, none of them end up beating Shesterkin, the Sharks with the grand total of 0 goals on the board, but he certainly did a lot of things to try and get a goal for the Sharks here tonight. Maybe he had that extra juice from having been brought, given a spot in the All-Star game coming up in just under a month's time as the San Jose Sharks representative, fully deserving of that honor, I guess, if you want to call it. On the second line, we had Couture, Dahlin, and Gregor, which were a very effective line for the San Jose Sharks in the previous game against the Detroit Red Wings. Was it the same thing? Not necessarily. I don't think Couture was necessarily as dominant as he was in the previous game against the Red Wings, but he was still very good here tonight, I must say. Dahlin had a couple of issues. It was such a great performance from him in the previous one against the Red Wings, like it was for Logan Couture, and so it was going to be very difficult for him to actually replicate such a performance here tonight, especially since the Rangers were obviously going to be tougher competition than the Red Wings. Having said that, maybe you were still expecting a bit more out of Dahlin, but it wasn't an awful game. When it comes to Gregor, I mean, it's kind of just going to sound like a broken record. Gregor had chances. He didn't bury the chances. That's pretty much the point final there when it comes to Noah Gregor. On the third line, it was the return of Nick Bonino here tonight. Obviously takes the spot of Weatherby with his usual line mates of Andrew Cogliano and Matt Nieto. And this line actually had a few solid offensive chances, at the very least earlier on in this game. There was this one particular shift early in the first period where it was this third line combining with Erik Karlsson to actually have some very nice passing. It was solid coverage by the Rangers defensively, and yet the Sharks, this third line, kept finding holes, and it ended up with a solid Erik Karlsson chance on net. Obviously doesn't go in, but it was still nice to see that Bonino did not miss a lick of chemistry with these two other players. That ended up not really persisting throughout the entire game, but still there were some decent chances from this third line, and that was nice to see. On the fourth line, Weatherby actually still ends up remaining in the lineup. I had thought that Nick Merkley could potentially stay in the lineup and Weatherby would end up being the healthy scratch, but that doesn't end up being the case here tonight. Weatherby, I guess, with the seniority, manages to keep a spot in the lineup with Raska and VL, and this fourth line actually didn't look terrible. Obviously they didn't get amazing offensive opportunities, but they also didn't really give up much defensively and had the majority of the possession when it came to when they were actually on the ice. But this fourth line definitely seems to be leaning more towards the sort of enforcer style of fourth line compared to maybe a slightly more offensive fourth line that we would get when Peterson and such were on it, because VL we obviously know he's definitely much more of a physical player. And Adam Raska being brought up, even though he had some decent offensive games when it came to the preseason and rookie tournament prior to the start of this season, it seems as though he has maybe been told by coaches, or he just seems to believe that he needs to really bring a physical style of game to be able to maintain a spot in the lineup, because that's exactly what it ends up doing. And I don't hate it necessarily. I'm not in love with the fact that the Sharks are kind of running two enforcers now at this point, if you want to call them that. But it's also not necessarily the end of the world either. It's not as though the Sharks' fourth line was doing anything marvelous earlier on this season. Anyway, one thing that I would like to see is that while Raska is playing hard, he does need to stay out of the penalty box now. 2 penalties in the 2 games he played. Not exactly a pace you want to keep up. On the defensive side of things, like I said, the Sharks actually played rather well, at the very least prior to the third period. They didn't really give a lot of chances to the Rangers in the first 40 minutes of this game, and so credit does have to go to a Sharks defensive core that has been rather solid for these past couple of games. Ferraro and Burns doing a pretty decent job, especially against the offensive powerhouses that the Rangers do hold of Adam Fox, Artemi Panarin, Mika Zibanejad, Chris Kreider. All these players, fantastic offensive players, but didn't necessarily get a ton doing at even strength because of some solid defensive play from the Sharks. One player who I definitely do want to point to is Erik Karlsson, who was not only rather solid defensively here tonight, but also had some great plays offensively. Far and away the Sharks' best offensive defenseman on the night, better than the first pairing Brent Burns and the third pairing Ryan Merkley, who would obviously be his main competition in that particular role. Karlsson had a lot of great chances. Like I mentioned earlier on, he had that great shift with the third line, but that was just the first, or maybe even the second, honestly, of many in this particular game. Just like I've said multiple times, none get past Shesterkin. His partner, Jacob Megna, has been doing a pretty decent job, to say the least, I would say. It's kind of difficult because Megna obviously plays a much more defensive style of game. So when it comes to comparing with Erik Karlsson's usual pairing player, which is Jacob Middleton, it's hard to say if Megna has been better or worse than Middleton. I suspect that if, let's say, Middleton were to be healthy for the upcoming game on Saturday against the Penguins, he would get the spot back in the lineup, just because, like with Weatherby over Nick Merkley, seniority, you could say. But Megna definitely hasn't really skipped a beat in the Erik Karlsson-Jacob Middleton pairing that we saw earlier on this season prior to his injury. And when it comes to the third pairing of Merkley and Vlasic, obviously the big talk has to be Ryan Merkley, because he's just been such an interesting player to watch thus far this season. I was really impressed with some of the confident plays that Ryan Merkley was going for. He seemed to, when he would get the puck, he'd seem to have his first instinct be to try and make a play happen, which I think is actually a good thing, and hopefully doesn't sort of get ironed out of him by the coaching staff. You want him to try and be this enigmatic and offensively minded player, just so he can continue his development into becoming, a top 4 defenseman for the San Jose Sharks, which he actually seems to be on a path to becoming. The main issue for Ryan Merkley is that while he was making these confident plays this game, he kind of didn't really have much of a finish to them. A lot of the times he put himself into a position, it reminds me a lot of William Eklund when he was here earlier on this season in his 9 games. He'd put himself into a position where he didn't really have an open passing lane, or he'd end up kind of just falling over or mishandling the puck at a specific situation, and it'd end up going back into the possession of the New York Rangers. So if he just gets a bit more finesse to that game with that confidence and with that puck handling, he should be able to tie things together and become a very solid player. We'll see if that ends up developing over these next few games. Hopefully he can stay in the lineup. And finally, we move on to Adin Hill, who honestly didn't have a particularly bad game here tonight, but in the end he does get outdueled by Igor Shesterkin, a point that I mentioned earlier when it came to Shesterkin. I said you needed sure goals to be able to beat him, because goals where you're not getting a ton of traffic in front or a lot of net crashing, it's going to be very difficult to get one by him, and I compared him to a more league average goaltender like Adin Hill, who we saw here tonight. You take a look at the goals that he did let in, Chris Kreider, Schneider as well. Neither of these 2 goals were particularly bad. Neither were of the level of in the previous game where he gave up that goal, the second goal to the Detroit Red Wings. However, those were 2 goals that when Shesterkin saw chances like that, he managed to make the saves on, but Hill didn't really manage to match in that regard. So not a bad game for Hill, but he does end up losing the duel here tonight. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they will take on the Pittsburgh Penguins for the second and final time this season. It's impossible to forget how the first game between these two teams went. It was only about a couple of weeks ago at this point. The Sharks fell behind 6-1 in the first period, one of their worst periods of all time in franchise history, and yet they managed to claw their way back to within one by the early points of the third period, but unfortunately were unable to get the game-tying goal, would end up losing it 8-5. So the Sharks will be looking to replicate the success they had in the second and third periods against the Pittsburgh Penguins in that first game, and not look to repeat the failures that they had in that first period against them. Class dismissed.